Hello and welcome to this new blog post from the Sustainability Accounting series. As usual, here the disclaimer. And what we are going to cover today is the operational budgeting with sustainability factors. In the previous blog post, we already covered a couple of these techniques, and we started off with ring fencing, some money that we set aside for sustainability related initiatives and cost allocations or allocations in general. And then we had a look at capitals budgeting. And in the last blog post, we had a look at how to set up a water budget. So last time we said, okay, capitals budgeting and shadow pricing, this belongs somehow together. And when we did budgeting for the water price, actually we did not use a shadow price because the price of water is usually fixed by your service provider. But this time we want to extend this view and use an example where we really need a shadow price. So in this blog post, again, we focus on capitals budgeting and shadow pricing. But for a different example. But before we jump into that, let us quickly review what we investigated last time when we were creating this budgeting for water, or this budget for water. And here we focused on a resource, a natural resource where we had a market price. And actually what we used was, we used a stocked item and then used electronic reporting, ER, to analyze the variances that we had between the planned data and the actual consumption of the data. And we did not really use the budgeting module because we could use electronic reporting in a way that we could extract the actual budgeting data. This does not mean that we do not need budgeting or the budget module for this purpose, but it was possible to realize this without this budgeting module. What we will investigate today is shadow pricing. And in this following example, I would like to focus on a CO2 budget where we use shadow pricing, and we use this for travel related transactions. If we are doing that, then there are a couple of hurdles that we have to jump over. The first one is that this calculation process is rather complex. So if you want to calculate a CO2 budget amount for some travel related costs, then you have to calculate the distance traveled. You need a consumption factor, you need a conversion factor, for example, for the means of transport needed, and then you need to have an estimate or idea about the CO2 price. Then the other point listed here is that not all data and calculations are inside of Dynamics. So you have to think how to record this data. Then another thing that makes it more complex is the mixture of the different means of transport. So you can travel by airplane, car, train, other means of public transport, or a mix of them. And to budget for that makes this more complex, because people usually do not travel only by car or by airplane, but use a mix of different means of transport. And the last point is also important. You need somehow to motivate your people to reduce their travel related CO2 emissions. So what I want to show you in the following is how we can use the travel app, the Power app that I showed you in one of the previous blog posts, in combination with budget planning. And the idea is the following. So on the left hand side, we have the actual data that are recorded through the Power app. And what we are doing there is we record the data and we post the transactions, so the kilos and the amounts, the CO2 budget amount, actual amount, on statistical accounts. And then on the right hand side, we have the budget data that we record through a budget plan, convert it into CO2 kilograms and amounts, and then post them on statistical accounts so that we are at the end of the day able to run this actual versus budget report. Okay, here again the Power app, and that's basically what I want to show you in the following in my demo machine. So let's have a look at how this can be configured. Okay, I opened here the business travel app that I used in one of the previous blog posts. The only thing that I changed here was the financial dimension. So I used department instead of cost center, just because my budget planning process, the one that I used in this and the previous blog post, was based on departments rather than cost centers. So that's a small change. And what I show you here is basically how you can record the different transactions and calculate the CO2 emissions. So let's do that, and let's say, okay, we fly 1000 kilometers, and based on the setup here, you can see that we emit here 211 kilograms CO2. These are the emission costs. If I take to the airport a long distance train, then you can see the emission costs here. And of course, I will also record some overnight stays in a hotel to calculate here the emission costs. So these are 3 nights. Let's say we are in a 3-star hotel. Based on that, we calculate emission cost of 62 kilo. And let's say that's all what we have to record here for our business trip. So if I complete this one here, then the app will close and trigger a flow. So let us jump to Microsoft Flow and refresh that. So it should not take too long until this flow is running. The system seems a bit slow or hanging. Let's see if the journal is created. Yeah, so the flow was probably faster than we thought. If we look into the lines, then we can see the travel costs for this department and the amount. And the offset account is of course a kind of statistical liability account, while the debit account is also a statistical travel cost account. And if we look at the journal for the accommodation, we have similar statistical account with a financial dimension, and here something similar on the liability account. So what is missing is just to post these transactions to get the actual CO2 kilogram and amount data into our system. So these were the actual data recorded and posted. Okay, now what is missing, if you remember the slide that I showed you, is the blue arrow on the right hand side, which basically refer to our budget plan. And to save some time here, I already created a budget plan, this one here. So I basically hit here new, selected my budget plan and recorded some lines already. And what I did here is the following. Let me record the missing lines for department 27. So I recorded here 4 lines for department 25, 4 lines for department 26, and now let's record the last lines for department 27, sorry. And what I do here is I have a statistical account that is called here CO2 DOM SD. DOM stands for domestic business trips. SD stands for single day. And now I just enter here department 27. Then I enter something here for domestic business trips, MD, multiple days. So let's say I plan, or last year I had 11 business trips. So that's the column here, number of business trips last year. And then what I want the department heads to enter is the number of business trips they plan for this year. Okay, and then we continue. Then I have a statistical account for international business trips for a single day. I enter here just 12. And then I have account for international business trips for multiple days. And let's say we choose here 3. So that's basically what you have to enter. And then if I start the workflow here, what will happen is the following. So let's click the submit button first. So this last year's business trips, they will be taken as the basis to generate budget plans for the different departments that I have. So for department 25, 26, 27, there will be a small budget plan created where this last year business trips will be copied into this column, and where the department heads can adjust this amount. So the number of business trips they plan for the following year, that's what they have to enter and then resubmit to the finance or an administrative department. Yeah. So let us have a look at whether this worked or not. Simply by filtering for the not approved budget plans. And here you can see what already happened. I have a budget plan for IT, HR, and legal. So if you click into that, then you can see basically what I said. Here we have the number of business trips last year. This is what I planned. I basically just copied this value, and then the people can come here and say, okay, I planned 20 here, maybe 5 there, 2 international one for multiple days, and 3 international one for single days. And that's what I expect from the department managers to do. And then once they are done, they complete this process. And of course, each and every department manager would have to do the same. So the HR manager, he can also come here and enter and modify these dates. And once he's done, he says, I'm finished, I'm completed with my budgeting. And of course, the same happens for the IT department. Let's say we plan here 22 trips, and then we say we are finished. Okay, so that's their job basically. And what will happen is, if these small budget plans for the different departments are finished, they will be accumulated into this one. So I aggregate the data. But rather than waiting here until all are finished, it's already the case. But nevertheless, let's have a look at the different steps, how I set up this budget planning configuration. And I will do that here in the budgeting module to show you what I set up. And to identify this easier, I use the prefix CO2. So here are 2 scenarios, the budget trips from last year and the one planned. That's what I asked the managers to complete. And then I have the kilograms and the amounts. That's what I want to calculate. Then I have different stages. This is just what I need for the workflow. So I created this. This is what we completed. Then I have the department review and completion. And then there is the aggregation. So that's the point where we are currently. So if I go here, I basically have to say, okay, step 4 is I review the associated budget plans. They are completed. I got the message from the managers that they are complete. So I hit here complete and say that's finished. And then what will happen is there will be a CO2 kilograms value calculated and an amount. And then the last steps are, basically just some approvals, some final checks, and so on. From a workflow perspective, I have these steps. So the initial creation, that's what finance or the administrative department is doing. Then we aggregate this, and then we have these calculation steps. And the calculation is done based on these allocation schedules. So let me show you what I'm doing. I have here a calculation, basically 4 calculation schedules that start with S7 for step 7 in my workflow. I have here step A, B, C, and D, and the difference is here based on the kind of business trip. So this one is a domestic business trip for a single day. Then we have an international business trip for a single day. Then for a domestic business trip for multiple days and an international business trip for multiple days. And what I use here are different allocation rules. These allocation rules, they look at the source. This is the number of business trips, and they calculate the kilos. So this is what this allocations are doing whenever you see step 7 in front. And then further down I have a step 9, and here is basically something very similar. So I take the number of business trips planned and then I calculate an amount with the help of this allocation rule. So let's have a quick look at this allocation rule and how it's set up. So it's basically here an allocation rule that looks at the source, so at this statistical account, and it considers all departments, and the destination is the same account, but now we differentiate between the different departments that we have, and the allocation is made on this basis, and the basis is basically a posted or recorded amount, in our case the number of business trips from this department. So that's implemented by this rule, and then the key of the whole allocation is this number. So I multiply the number of business trips by this amount. If we look at the next rule, where I say international business trips for a single day, I use a different multiplier. If we look at domestic trips for multiple days, I use a different multiplier. And now you might ask the question, how do you calculate this multiplier? Well, I prepared an Excel file to explain you this in more detail. So let's have a look at my Excel file. And what you see here are 4 different sections. So the first section looks at 1 day domestic business trips. Then I have multiple day domestic business trips, 1 day overseas travels, and then finally multiple days overseas travels. And what I did first was I was making an assumption about the vehicles or the means of transport that are typically used when, let's say, making a 1 day domestic business trip. And here I said, in 80% of the cases, that's done by a business car. In 5% of the cases I fly, and in 15% of the cases I use probably a train, public transport. I did the same for multiple day business trips, but used the different allocation percentages, and I did the same for international business trips, where I typically fly more often. And then I also need the distance traveled, and that's also based on experience, based on historical data, where I say, okay, a domestic business trip where I drive to a customer and come back usually is for 800 kilometers. For multiple day business trip, it's usually 1,200 kilometers, and so on. And with this data, I can then calculate the kilometers and the CO2 kilograms issued. And these are the numbers that I just highlight. These are my multipliers. And then the same principle is used when I calculate the CO2 cost, where I have basically this amount multiplied by the CO2 price, which is in my case 140 euro per ton of CO2 emitted. So that's the whole magic, how this is calculated. So if you look at this calculation for the amount of CO2, then you can see the multiplier here. Okay, so this is basically what these allocation schedules are doing. And then if you look at the stage allocations, you will see that here, starting from stage 5, I execute these 4 different allocations, and then in stage 6 I execute these allocations. So if we look at our budget plan, and maybe let's refresh that one, then we should see how the number of business trips is converted into kilograms. So that's the kilograms emitted from 22 business trips that are done inside the country, but for multiple days by this department. So that's the CO2 emitted, and that's the amount based on a CO2 price of 140 tons. And then, of course, the finance department or the administrative departments can make adjustments, can get an approval, and finally transfer them to budget register entries. And that's the key, because I need this data in my budget register entries later on so that I can run a report on that. So I have here a budget model, I have a budget plan scenario and a budget plan code. And if I click generate, which I will not do because I have done this before, then we can see here in the budget register entries, 2 entries that I later on use for my report that compares the actual and budget data. So you can see that I have here a budget code for the quantity and for the amount, and if I click into that, you can see the data that are transferred basically. Okay, so that's the step that is needed to record this budget data. And once all of that is done and you have recorded some actuals, you can then go into the general ledger, into the financial reports, and create a report that basically compares the actual and budget data. And that's a very, very simple report, because the only thing you need to do is you have to include these statistical accounts and create different columns for the actual and budget data. So this probably takes a while because I just started this machine, but ultimately it will show up and should show us this reporting data. So very, very simple process. The Power App records the actual data. In the budget planning configuration and in the budget plan, we calculate CO2 kilograms and CO2 amounts for the different departments. So we send this to the different departments, get the feedback, calculate the totals, and then we can of course approve and complete all of these things. And then the last step is here this report, which ultimately finished. And then you can say, okay, here's the CO2 budget in kilograms. That's the price used for my budget. That's the amount. And then I have the actuals here. So that's basically what I want to share with you. Now let us go back to my PowerPoint, where I want to give you some additional information, some closing notes. So after this demonstration, let's have a look at the process or the configuration that I made for my budget planning process. So we started off with an operational budgeting hierarchy, and this is the same that I used in the previous blog post. And what we did is we used an administrative department, in my case the finance department, for which we did not record a budget, but where the finance department specified the number of business trips from last year, and then gave the different department heads from IT, HR, and the legal department the chance to adjust it and plan for the next year. Based on that and the calculations that we configured, we calculated the CO2 kilograms and amounts, and then accumulated the data. And finally, we recorded this in the budget register entry form so that we can run a financial report that compares these budget register entries with the actual data. So I will not do the demo because I showed you this before. And here again is the sample report that I used. So where we have in the first 3 columns the budget data, so the kilos, the average CO2 price used, and the amount. And then on the right hand side here in blue is the actual kilograms, the price used for the actual price calculation. And in this case it's different. I calculated an actual CO2 price of 50, which is basically defined by the German government. And then I came up with an actual CO2 amount. Also here we can skip the demo because I already showed you that one. So in summary, what I showed you here is how can CO2 based budgets and actuals be integrated and tracked in Dynamics 365 out of the box, in order to implement this sustainability concept in Dynamics. Of course, the setup and the necessary configurations and calculations that I showed you, they are rather complex. It's not something that you can easily configure without having a deeper knowledge on CO2 pricing, valuations, budget planning setup, financial report setup, and so on. But what I want to show you is that the available standard tools can actually incorporate all of the things we need. It might not be the smartest and the most user-friendly way doing that, but that's not the main issue here, because you can always improve what I demonstrate you. The main point that I want to transfer here is that we have a rich tool set available that can incorporate all of the things that we need for sustainability budgeting. Yeah? Okay, as usual, here are my contact details in case you have questions or if you want to leave comments or something. With this, I want to close it for today. I would like to thank you very much for your attention and look forward to seeing you in the next webcast.